I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, here with a micro edition of Smart Drug Smarts. This is not going to be a full edition. This is not episode number 81, which will be out on Friday like usual, but we had a little something that I wanted to squeeze in there. Starting this Thursday is the Quantified Self conference in San Francisco that I'm going to be attending. And leading up to that, I did a little interview with Ernesto Ramirez, who's the press coordinator for Quantified Self. And I wanted to get that out before the event started. So what you're going to hear is just a little teaser, tidbit, a quick interview for those of you who might want to learn more about Quantified Self, the Quantified Self movement, Quantified Self conference, and what's going on there. If you hang around until the end of this micro edition, we've also got a giveaway code that they gave to Smart Drug Smarts listeners. So if you want to come and check out the Expo, this coupon that they were kind enough to give us will give you about $10 off the ticket price. The way that it works is that Thursday and Friday are the conference, and then Saturday is the public expo. Probably should have mentioned that up front, but now I am. So this is just going to be a quick little conversation, about 15 minutes in length. Totally worth listening to, even if you have no intention, no ability to make it to San Francisco this weekend for the Quantified Self Conference. It's still kind of an interesting little state of the union of where Quantified Self is at right now, what people are into, the ethos behind the whole movement. So let's jump in now with Ernesto Ramirez.
We are Quantified Self Lab, so we're a small organization. It's about 4 people now at the conference coming up. We brought in a few extras. But basically, back in 2007, Gary Wolf and Kevin Kelly got together. They were both at Wired, both writers and editors there, and they were looking at what is the next thing coming in terms of personal computing. Wired magazine really kind of rode the personal computing revolution to great success. By 2007, everyone knew everyone is going to have a computer. Everyone's going to have a laptop. The iPhone was right there on the horizon. And they saw that computing was going to come much closer to the body, and it was going to impact our lives in a variety of different ways because data was starting to come closer to us, because data was starting to reflect who we are and what we're doing. And there were new sensor technologies and all these different things that were able to help us capture that data. So that started with basically a meetup in 2008 at Kevin Kelly's studio, and about 30 people showed up, and that was the genesis of kind of how we've done everything since then. They like to tell the story of the last gentleman to walk through the door was asked to present first, and he opened up his laptop and said, "This is every 15 minutes of my life for the last few years," color-coded it on a calendar. We've kind of taken that ethos of what Quantified Self is really a place, and now multiple places, for people to showcase what they're doing with their personal data. So we have the crazy and fantastic, this minute-by-minute time tracking is actually pretty popular, all down to the kind of mundane, regular Fitbit weight tracking kind of thing that people have been doing for a long time.
For your average person that is really a Quantified Self geek, how many minutes or hours per day do they spend on the tracking? What is the quantification of the quantification costing them?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And it's funny because every time I've seen someone talk about time tracking, and there's a variety of different ways to do it, that's usually the first question, which is, you have so much of your time tracked, how much time does it take you? And what most people tend to forget is the people that really like doing this stuff also like automating things. It actually tends to be quite easy. A lot of people use passive sensing tools to track time and productivity, things like rescue time or other time trackers. And then it's really just the time that you take in analysis where most of your actual processing time comes in.
What is the crossover between Quantified Self and do-it-yourself? I mean, it seems like the early adopters, probably a lot of the people really are do-it-yourselfers that are kind of figuring out these systems and building their own gadgetry and setting up their own spreadsheets and all this, whereas maybe it's now becoming more accessible to people that aren't the do-it-yourselfer type but still want access to the data, and you're kind of following in others' footsteps. How do you see that trend?
I think there's definitely an overlap. When you look at the Venn diagram of technology right now and kind of technoculture, we have DIY, we have the maker movement, and I think Quantified Self kind of fits in that trifecta of a Venn diagram. We're part of that, and I think from what we've seen is that there's a pretty large contingent of the people that are self-tracking, both the people that have been doing it for a long, long time and people that are very new to it, that come with the ethos of, in order for me to really understand myself, I'm going to have to build some type of system or some type of analysis or some type of visualization on my own. this is one of the things that we've seen time and time again, even with simple things like a Fitbit or a weight scale that gives you data, has a mobile application. The real interesting things happen when people actually can access that data and then make something out of it themselves. You mentioned spreadsheets, and I think that is probably my favorite DIY implementation within the Quantified Self community. People ask all the time, like, what's your favorite tracking tool? And I said time and time again, it's a spreadsheet because it's an open canvas for you to track whatever you'd like.
Now, most people, when they're thinking about quantified self, they're probably thinking about tracking pedometer stuff or heart rate variability, kind of the physical things. What are you seeing that's outside that realm, beyond just physical measurements?
So beyond physical measurements, there's a lot that's happening in terms of mood. So mood tracking has been very, very popular, pretty much since we've started talking about quantified self back in 2008 and started having these meetups around the world and now these conferences. And I think that is something that's really, really interesting, which is people trying to figure out how do they actually feel during the day and what are the inputs and outputs that are affecting those feelings. But we also have different things like cognition. We had some great, great talks over the last few years around people trying to track whether or not their mental processes and their cognition is improving. Quite famously or infamously, we had a series of talks both refuting and also confirming the fact that eating butter improved cognitive performance. This was the kind of famous Seth Roberts and his butter mind experiments. Those are actually really, really interesting too, because it's hard to measure your cognitive performance. There's so many different ways to do it, and there's so many ways you can get it wrong. In some cases, all you're really measuring is whether or not you can learn a task.
Yeah, separating the learning from actual cognition is really, really difficult.
Exactly. And we had some great people. There's a website, I believe it's still up, called Quantified Mind. It's either .com or .org, and they basically translated a bunch of cognitive performance testing onto a website so people could do that on their own.
What do you guys provide as far as resources or training, or nudges in the right direction to make sure that when people are setting up these N=1 experiments, that they're actually measuring something that's going to be valuable to them?
We've thought a lot about this, and I think rather than us saying this is exactly how you run an experiment, what we've tried to do is provide people with a wide variety of examples of how different types of experimentation and self-tracking can be done. So if you go to the Quantified Self website, we have now over 700, I think we're getting really close to 800 these days, of show and tell videos where people get up in front of a meetup group or at a conference and say, this is what I tracked, this is how I tracked it, and this is what I've learned. Some of those have rigorous experimental design, down to people blinding themselves and having friends set up experiments and dose them with different things like caffeine or something like that. To just, this is me tracking my food intake by taking pictures of what I was eating, and this is what I found out, how it's helped me eat more vegetarian food or, have a healthier diet.
Have you seen trends in what people are actually trying to optimize in their own lives using Quantified Self as a tool?
Yeah, there's definitely some people that are optimizing around weight loss, more activity, increasing sports and fitness performance. Those are the kind of things that would have happened without Quantified Self. That's just something that just normal culture does. But now we're starting to see a lot more interest in stress and what relates to overall stress during the day, both within the day and then, kind of just daily stress. So a lot of heart rate variability measurement is going on right now. And we're starting to see that become a little bit easier to do with more and more robust heart rate sensors. Some more stuff that's actually happening around the brain in EEG measurement. Sleep measurement is something that's super popular, but also very, very hard to do correctly.
Tell us about that.
So right now, most of the things that are tracking sleep with actigraphy. So they're using an accelerometer, usually in some sort of wristband or watch form factor. And you just don't get the fidelity that you would get from tracking actual electrical signals in the brain to understand sleep stages. I respect a lot of these companies. Some of them do it actually quite well. I was a huge fan of Zeo, even though it was like the dorkiest thing to wear. Zeo was the EEG band you wore around your forehead to sleep. But sleep is fascinating because it's this huge unknown piece of our life. And it's really hard to understand whether or not it's being tracked correctly because all you have is when you wake up in the morning and say like, well, I think that was good night's sleep, or I think that was bad. There's no way of knowing. I mean, it's really easy to tell whether or not a step tracker is working because you can just go outside and count 100 steps and look down at your Fitbit or your Jawbone and say, oh yeah, it says 105. That's pretty close. But there's no way to wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I know I got 2 hours of deep sleep.
We're talking about difficulties with quantifying cognition. But what about quantifying learning and how different types of learning systems can compare to one another?
So in terms of learning, one of the things that has come up, possibly because Gary Wolf, who's co-founder of Quantified Self, it's one of his sort of pet projects over the last decade. It's spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is this, it's a system of trying to make you remember something right before you're about to forget it. Basically, this is kind of based off of research from Ebbinghaus that looked at how quickly people forget things. A researcher developed some software called SuperMemo, which used that research and basically developed a flashcard system that only gave you flashcards right before you were actually about to forget it. It's no use basically reviewing things if it's already in your memory. It's only really useful right before you're about to forget to remind you what that information is. And so Stephen was actually figuring out, can I remember every day? So he would, at the end of a day, would write down a few things about what happened that day. Sometimes he had maybe a short video that he took or some photos from that day. And then his flashcards were basically that information. And he would try to process, okay, what actual day was that? Okay, based off of this information, it sounds like that was a weekend in June. Okay, that's June 22nd. It was an interesting kind of learning experiment.
What do you find doesn't lend itself well to trackability? Are there areas where people aren't really going to be able to be successful quantifiers just yet based on either technology or just because something is sort of too ephemeral to attach a number to?
My gut reaction is everything is trackable. It depends on the fidelity that you actually want. And I think a lot of people fall into the trap that the objectivity is going to lead people to answers. And that's not always the case. We've actually seen a lot of different people that have used things like journals, diaries, photos, kind of this more subjective tracking to bring information into their lives that normally wouldn't be there, and they wouldn't have that chance to kind of analyze it to understand what's been going on. The way that we've built up our culture, we have this belief and this trust in numbers that they somehow hold the truth, where saying someone is fit is different than saying someone can run a mile in under 4 minutes. And I think there's definitely room within quantified self, within self-tracking, within whatever people are trying to understand about themselves for both kind of systems, both these highly numerical, data-driven understanding, but also layering in subjectivity and context. In reality, all of this data that we collect lies within our contextual life, and we have to understand that context in order to really make sense of that data.
So tell us about the conference and what people might expect to see there.
Yeah, so we're holding the Quantified Self QS15 Conference and Expo on June 18th through the 20th at Fort Mason in San Francisco. Basically, we set this up. Typically, our conferences are 2 days. They're kind of like user conferences. People come from all over the world to engage with each other, with ideas and with insights around self-tracking. The program is just jam-packed. We typically get I can't believe there's this much stuff and I have no idea what I can go to because there's too much. And so we have people give these, what we call these show and tell talks, where they stand up on stage and talk about their own self-tracking, what they did, how they did it, what they learned. We have breakout discussions where people facilitate 1 hour group discussions around topics of interest, all the way from highly technical things like data flows and APIs to highly philosophical topics like, what are we talking about when we say the self in Quantified Self? Or what does privacy mean in a world where everyone's tracking something about everyone else? The conference with our third day, which is our public expo. So if you're in San Francisco, we would love for you to come down. That expo is going to have a variety of different tool makers, ranging from people working in health and fitness like MyFitnessPal to people doing amazing things. We've actually got 2 companies now that are doing transcranial direct current stimulation that are going to be there.
Last question. What do you think people are going to be able to track maybe 3 to 5 years from now that they're not able to yet just based on technical limitations?
So I think one of the biggest things that's coming down the pipeline is being able to track biomarkers in real time or within the confines of your own home. What I mean by that is simply doing blood tests in your kitchen or in your bathroom when you'd like to. So right now, it's typically under the purview of the medical establishment. It's somewhat expensive, and the data is pretty rough. You get 1 or 2 numbers out of a lot of blood tests. It's coming really quickly, I think, down the line where it's getting cheaper, the data is getting a lot easier to understand, and we're going to start to understand that biomarkers and our metabolism has an ebb and a flow. And that ebb and a flow it can't be represented in 1 blood test a year during your annual physical.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you to Ernesto Ramirez for taking the time for that interview. I'm quite excited, obviously, about this whole thing. I'm going to be flying up to the Bay Area tomorrow, hanging out there for a couple of days before, probably a couple of days after, and I'm pretty much for sure assuming that I'm going to be able to harvest a couple of future Smart Drug Smarts interviews from the people that I'll be meeting at the conference. There's going to be quite a bit of overlap with the kind of stuff that we're interested in with the attendees in that group, I am sure. So I'll probably let you know on, not this week's edition, but the June 26th edition, how the conference went, what I found out, who I met, etc., etc. But for now, as promised, a few little details. So the Conference Expo is on June 20th. That's this coming Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the Herbst Pavilion. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Basically the very, very, very farthest that you can go on the San Francisco Peninsula north without actually drowning. It's stretching out into the bay as far as I can tell from Google Maps. They've got a website set up at qs15.quantifiedself.com. And should you go there with the intention of buying a ticket, if you enter the promotion code SMARTPOD, that's SMARTPOD, then you will get a $10 discount. We'll also put a direct link that includes the discount code on the website. So if you're in the area, definitely check it out. And also, if you wind up going because you heard about it on this podcast, if you're a Smart Drug Smarts listener, definitely don't be shy about introducing yourself. Shoot me an email or tweet me on Twitter or something like that. I'll be ambling about checking things out, so I would be super, super happy to say hi if you find yourself there. Okay, so that is it for this micro edition. There's not really much more to say. Be back at you in just a couple days on Friday with episode number 81. Until then, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.